Greetings, everyone, and Happy New Year. Well, it's not quite the new year, meaning that you still have till midnight, December 31st, to make a 2022 tax-deductible donation to your favorite nonprofits that work so hard throughout the year enhancing the quality of life in our communities. And as a personal plug, if you like what we're doing here on Buzz for Good, to shine a light on the great work that nonprofits do, please go to buzzforgood.com. That's buzz, B-U-Z-Z, 4good.com. And under support, make a tax-deductible gift. All contributions support the production of this radio show, as well as our Blue Ridge PBS show, Buzz, that airs every Wednesday night on Blue Ridge PBS. Today's show, we are featuring the Harrison Museum of African American Culture inside Center in the Square in downtown Roanoke, because next Friday, January 6th at 5:30 p.m., the Harrison Museum is hosting a special presentation on the famed Tuskegee Airmen. This presentation will be conducted by a man who is not only an expert historian on the Tuskegee Airmen, but the son of one of its pilots. Real quick intro, my name is Michael Hemphill. I'm the creator and host of both this radio show and the TV show Buzz, and I invite you to our next watch party on Tuesday, January the 3rd at 5:30 p.m. at the Grandin Theater in Roanoke, where we will offer a sneak peek at our next new episode starring Boys and Girls Clubs of Southwest Virginia. Register at buzzforgood.com. That's buzz, B-U-Z-Z, 4good.com. You can also stay connected with us throughout the week on our social media, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, all at Buzz for Good. Now, on to our show. A found $5 bill in an Iowa field paid for Luther Smith's first plane ride in the 1930s. It was a life-changing moment for this Black American teenager that led to him getting his pilot's license and ultimately becoming one of the famed Tuskegee Airmen during World War II. His service inspired his son, Gordon Smith, to become an expert on the fighter group, and Gordon Smith is coming to Roanoke on January 6th to speak about the legend of the Tuskegee Airmen at the Harrison Museum of African American Culture. A graduate of Princeton University with a degree in American history, Gordon Smith regales audiences around the United States on the legend of the Tuskegee Airmen, including tales of his father and his harrowing final mission in 1944. Now, admission to Gordon Smith's talk is free for students with an ID. For all others, there is a suggested donation of $25. That's just a suggested donation. If you can't or choose not to pay anything, you are still more than welcome to come and hear the talk. More information at harrisonmuseum.com. Earlier this week, I connected by Zoom with Gordon Smith, whose day job is executive director of the commercial banking group at J.P. Morgan Chase Bank in New York. I started out by asking him how a banker also becomes an American history expert. You are coming to talk about the legend of the Tuskegee Airmen. And usually when I hear of a historical presentation, I'm accustomed to seeing, someone with some collegiate initials, with them, PhD of this, or, he or she is the professor of this, that, or the other. And you're coming to us from a banking conglomerate. So how did you get involved with the Tuskegee Airmen?
So very fair question, Michael. Yes, you're stuck with just talking to a plain vanilla commercial banker today. But another role is sharing some of our nation's history. Actually, I was an American history major at Princeton, but my father, Luther Smith, was one of the original pilots in the group that we now call the Tuskegee Airmen. Their official designation was the 332nd Fighter Group, and Yep. My dad was one of the original fighter pilots in the group. He flew 133 combat missions. So as you can appreciate, having flown that many missions, he had a lot of stories, a lot of information to provide. And over the years, it's been my pleasure and privilege to be invited to various venues around the country to share some of that history. I'll go into a little bit more detail during my presentation about what the training was like at Tuskegee. I take them through a typical day as a fighter pilot. Um, I will expand a little bit more about my dad's last mission, which is, as you got a little teaser on, is a real heart stopper. And then I just share some of the challenges that he and all the airmen face once they returned, because here they were extraordinary fighter pilots. Those that wanted to pursue a career in commercial aviation were not allowed to. The U.S. airlines wouldn't hire any of them. So here they had this extraordinary record, and yet the commercial airlines wouldn't hire them. And so, nonetheless, these men, who were all people of incredible achievement already at the age of 22, 23, many of them went on to very distinguished careers as lawyers and bankers and doctors and engineers, et cetera. And so it's just a phenomenal story. And for every pilot, there were 992 pilots, there were 10 ground crew. So when we say Tuskegee Airmen, there were roughly 14,000 folks who trained at Tuskegee, but of that, there were 992 actual pilots, folks who had successfully achieved their U.S. military aviator wings, and 355 who actually deployed. And as I said to you earlier, there's only 3 still alive today. They're 97 and 98 years old.
Where was your father from?
My father was originally from Des Moines, Iowa.
Okay. And so came to Tuskegee for the program.
Right. So just to give a little bit of background, as you and your listeners may or may not be aware, prior to the start of World War II, the U.S. military forces were segregated. And not only were they segregated, but at the time, in the 1920s and 30s, as aviation was starting to develop as a branch of the military, African Americans were not permitted to fly aircraft in the United States military. So we kind of go back in history, you think that, well, wow, that's kind of silly to think. You think about the role that African Americans played in the Revolution and in the Civil War and in World War I, and the valuable contributions that they had. But yet, in the 1920s, our government had a formal policy that would not allow African Americans to become U.S. military aviators. So there was quite a obstacle if you were a young man growing up, an African American, and this was something that you wanted to pursue. There was really no pathway for that to happen. But as developments took place in Europe, and it looked increasingly likely that there was going to be a war, Congress passed what was called the Civilian Pilot Training Program, where the effort was made to start to train civilians to fly in the eventuality that they may need to become military pilots. And so that program was open to all. And so there were many African Americans who pursued learning how to fly in the civilian pilot training program. My father was one of them. So he actually had his pilot's license before the war began. He was born in 1920. So in 1940, he would have been 20 years old. So before the war broke out in 1941, he already had his pilot's license. And there was a lot of pressure that was put on the government by the African American press and Black religious leaders and union leaders, et cetera, to open up the U.S. military to allow African Americans to pursue becoming U.S. military aviators. So the government wasn't really thrilled about it, to say the least, but they eventually decided that they would allow African Americans to learn to train to become U.S. military aviators. And so that training took place at Tuskegee College in Tuskegee, Alabama. So hence the name, the Tuskegee Airmen, that we now know today. But at the time, they were not known as the Tuskegee Airmen. They were just African Americans who were trying to live out their own personal dreams of becoming U.S. military aviators.
What did, just out of curiosity, what led your father to already have his pilot's license by the time the real funny anecdotal story that you and your listeners may appreciate. So my father was one of 9 kids.
his father was a Methodist minister. So as you can imagine, being one of 9 kids in the 1920s during the Depression, it was pretty modest upbringing, to say the least. And he had 3 brothers, and so he and one of his brothers, whose name Howard, were out walking in a field, and they found a $5 bill. And my father talked his brother Howard into taking that $5 and going to the airport in Des Moines to get an airplane ride. And so reluctantly, my father's brother agreed. And so off they went to the Des Moines airport, and they purchased the ticket. They could $5 only got 1 ticket. So my father's brother actually sat on my father's lap, and the pilot took them up for an airplane ride. And I think the pilot got a great kick out of seeing these 2 young Black boys going up for the first time. They had never been up close to an airplane before, and needless to say, this is the first time they've ever been in an airplane. I don't know how thrilled my Uncle Howard was about it, but for my dad, that was a life-changing moment. From that point on, his whole life was centered around aviation and learning to become a pilot. And I think the genesis, the interest probably began in 1927 when Charles Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic. That was a huge event, obviously, for everyone, but that really struck a chord with my father. And living in Des Moines, Iowa, thousands of miles away from the Atlantic, he could only imagine what that was like to fly an airplane over the Atlantic. And then when he had that opportunity to go up in the airplane, as I said to you, Michael, that sealed the proverbial deal. And from that moment on, he was really focused on a career in aviation. And so he started to walk to the airport every day after that initial flight. And there were various pilots and ground crew who noticed him and said, hey, kid, would you like to have a job here at the airport? And he was amazed because he was only 13 years old at the time. So what is it that you want me to do? And says, oh, you can help us fuel up the planes and you can clean the windshields, relatively menial type things. But that really sparked the interest. And then from that, they gave him additional responsibilities. So he had the opportunity to really learn all about airplanes and how they worked, et cetera.
Wow. All from a found $5 bill.
Found $5 bill in a field in Iowa.
Which is probably what's leading you here to Roanoke next week on January the 6th to talk about the Tuskegee Airmen.
Right, exactly. So as I said, it's been my privilege and pleasure to just share the history of the group. Their accomplishments were extraordinary, particularly so when you take into account the obstacles that they had to overcome just to become military aviators, the training that they went through, because as I referenced earlier to you, Michael, the government wasn't all that wild about having Black military aviators. And so there was a formal quota system that was put in place. And so there were many, many cadet aviation candidates who were clearly qualified, but didn't make it through the program because the government just wasn't going to let everybody through that qualified. So they had to go through all that. And then the actual combat experiences that they faced in Italy as fighter escort pilots.
Yeah, well, so once again, I'm joined here on Bus for Good by Gordon Smith, who's the executive director of the commercial banking group at J.P. Morgan Chase in New York, and is also coming to Roanoke on January the 6th to speak at the Harrison Museum of African American Studies on the legend of the Tuskegee Airmen. And let me ask you this. I mean, what was the impact of the Tuskegee Airmen militarily overseas, and then I guess domestically here at home?
So initially, there were 4 fighter groups, 4 fighter squadrons, Michael, that were put together that formed the group. And the first group went over in the spring of 1943, and they weren't really doing much of consequence. They were initially stationed in North Africa, and they just really weren't getting a whole lot of action. And there was a lot of folks who never wanted them there to begin with to say, look, they were called, their designation was the 99th Fighter Squadron. And people were saying, look, the 99th isn't really doing anything. Their accomplishments are minimal. And the commander of the group, whose name was Benjamin O. Davis Jr., actually got called back to the United States and had to face the War College based on these accusations. And he said, well, look, you're not giving us much responsibility. So how's it that you can criticize us for not having a lot of downed airplanes and a lot of aerial victories? And as it turns out, the War College and the senior military officers agreed and allowed the, quote, so-called experiment to continue. And training was taking place all this time at Tuskegee, and each month there were more and more pilots that were being trained. And so by the end of 1943, there were sufficient number of pilots to create 3 more fighter squadrons. And their designation was the 100th, the 301st, and the 302nd. So those 3 fighter squadrons deployed in January of 1944 to Italy. And they were initially stationed near Naples. And similar to the 99th Fighter Squadron, they weren't given a lot of responsibility. They were doing what was called harbor patrol. There were many missions that they would go on. They would never even see other German aircraft. So just not a lot was happening. But at the time, the American bombers were taking heavy losses as they were flying their daylight missions from Italy to Germany. And a new Air Force group was put together. It was called the 15th Air Force Group. And General Nathan Twining was head of the 15th. And he summoned Colonel Davis and asked him, are your boys ready to take on the mission of flying fighter escort? And Colonel Davis famously responded, my men are indeed ready to take on this responsibility. So at that point, which was in June of 1944, everything changed. And now they were going to be given frontline responsibility, Michael, to escort the U.S. bombers. So these were B-17s and B-24s that were part of the 15th Air Force Group stationed in the eastern part of Italy. And they were going to escort the bombers to Germany and back. And so now they were finally taking on a frontline, high-profile mission as fighter escort pilots. Well, the planes that they were getting, and the top plane at the time was the P-51 Mustang. And they were not getting brand new P-51 Mustangs. They were getting secondhand, hand-me-down planes from the other fighter groups. And as these planes were coming in to where the 332nd was stationed, which was in a little farming town in Italy called Ramitelli, as the planes were coming into Ramitelli from the other fighter groups, they all had different markings. And the 332nd wanted their own marking. The only thing they had in abundance was red paint. So they took the red paint and painted the tails of their P-51 Mustangs bright red.
Yep.
So that bright red tail was pretty distinctive. And as they started to begin flying fighter escort in June of 1944, the bomber groups, all of whom were made up of white airmen and white pilots, had no idea that these were black fighter pilots that were escorting them. But it suddenly dawned on them, mission after mission, whenever they were being escorted by these red-tailed Mustangs, they always made it back. And unlike some of the other groups, the other essentially white fighter groups, where they would get to the rendezvous point and the fighter groups weren't there, or oftentimes what would happen is that the Germans would send in fighters as they approached Germany, and the fighter groups would then go chase the German fighters, but then there would be another group of German fighters coming up, and there would be no fighter escort, and the bombers would take heavy losses. And so Colonel Davis made it very clear to the pilots in the 332nd that their mission was to stay with the bombers. The whole way you stay with the bombers. No one is authorized to go chasing after fighters just to improve your own record of kills unless authorized. And if anybody breaks formation and goes after a fighter without authorization, they will be court-martialed. Well, they were all in awe of Colonel Davis. Colonel Davis was the first African-American to have graduated from West Point in the 20th century. While he was there, he was given the silent treatment. He had the room by himself. No one talked to him other than to provide an order. And so they were all in awe of Colonel Davis. And he was a very impressive fellow. When he walked in the room, you knew he was there. And so when he provided this order to the men, they all understood that. And so they not only were highly trained, but just highly disciplined, and they listened to him. And so that was part of their success, that because of their discipline and training, they stayed with the bomber groups. And the bomber groups, as I said, really recognized that. And they began to get to the point where they didn't even want to go on the mission unless they were going to be escorted by the Red Tails. And as I said in the beginning, they had no idea that these were Black pilots. And then they found out that they were Black pilots. And again, as I started our talk this afternoon about the fact that the military was segregated, here they were segregated. They didn't even know that there was a group of Black fighter pilots. And now they were extolling the achievements and the accomplishments of the Black fighter pilots. And as you and some of your listeners may be aware, Michael, the fighter pilots oftentimes would put the name of their wives or their girlfriends on the front of their planes. Well, Colonel Davis put on the front of his plane by request. And that was because that's what all the bomber groups wanted. They wanted the 332nd to escort them. So there's just many, many stories of the white bomber pilots saying how the only reason they were alive was because of the Red Tails, and they became known also as the Red Tail Angels because they the phenomenal flying capabilities that they had. And so their record of losses was extraordinarily low. There was a myth about that they had never lost a bomber, but that actually was not true upon further research of what was called missionaire crew reports. There were reports in the very early days in June and July of some bombers that were being escorted by the 332nd that were lost enemy fire, but it was pretty much in the beginning. And then as time wore on, even the Germans began to really respect the Red Tails. And my dad and others would comment about how they would be escorting the bombers and they'd see the German fighters come up. But as the German fighters got close enough to see the Red Tails and the Mustangs, they would peel off. They just did not want to take on the Red Tail Mustangs. And so that, as I said, was part of the reason why a lot of the bomber pilots referred to the 332nd as the Red-Tailed Angels.
Fascinating. Well, once again, here on Buzz for Good, joined by Gordon Smith, who is works in the financial industry in New York as the executive director of the commercial banking group for JP Morgan Chase Bank, but is also an expert on the Tuskegee Airmen and will be coming to Roanoke on January the 6th to have a talk at the Harrison Museum of African American Culture, and more information can be found on the Harrison Museum's website. That you provided just a fabulous summary of their impact on the war effort overseas, but talk about what was their impact here at home, being the first.
Yeah. So as I said, the military was segregated, but when you look at the accomplishments of what the Tuskegee Airmen, the 332nd Fighter Group, was able to achieve, and here they were flying high-performance fighter planes, putting out an unbelievable, unmatched record as fighter escort pilots. And so the concept that Blacks were not capable of being U.S. military aviators, were not capable of performing at the highest level in the most challenging roles, obviously was completely destroyed by the accomplishments of the Tuskegee Airmen. And so it was shortly after the war that President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, which then desegregated the U.S. military forces. But it was largely due to the extraordinary accomplishments of the Tuskegee Airmen that was able to come about.
Tell me, how did you get connected with Roanoke and the Harrison Museum?
So my partner Nancy Gilroy and I have a friend, Linda Webb, who I think is very active with the Harrison Museum. And Linda and Nancy are classmates, the great Cornell class of '83. And so Linda learned about my having spoken at other venues about the Tuskegee Airmen, and she said, "We'd love to have you in Roanoke. Would you be willing to come?" And Nancy and I are delighted to be coming down to Roanoke in a couple of weeks.
Wonderful, wonderful. Once again, Gordon Smith will be speaking on January 6th at the Harrison Museum. They're asking for a $25 minimum donation to attend, and it's at 5:30 at Center in the Square at the Harrison Museum. Share with us what happened to your father after World War II.
Well, as I said, my dad flew 133 combat missions, which was a lot of missions. Unfortunately, they were not replacing the black pilots at the normal rate, as they should have been. Michael, a tour of duty for a fighter pilot in World War II was 50 missions. And after 50 missions, you were able to go home. But they weren't replacing the black pilots, so they had to keep on flying. So as you could see, at 133, he was almost on his third tour. And he, again, was loving the military, and he was thinking that, okay, my tour is going to be coming to an end pretty soon, and he thought he would go back to Tuskegee and serve as a training pilot, and perhaps be sent over to Japan as the war continued in Asia. So that's what he was thinking. But on his last mission, which was on Friday, October 13th, 1944, it started off like any other typical mission, escorting bombers to Germany. And then on the way back, the pilots were given what was called targets of opportunity, able to pursue targets of opportunity. So once they had safely escorted the bombers back across the bomb line, and the bombers were no longer in jeopardy of being attacked by German fighters, then the fighter pilots then could go after targets of opportunity, because again, the whole purpose was to destroy Germany's capability to maintain the capacity to fight. So they would go and strafe airfields and rail yards and anything that was connected to the German military. The pilots would go and attack. And so he, along with three other pilots, were seeking some targets of opportunity on their way back. And they knew there were two airports in Hungary, in Budapest, Hungary. And so they went down and strafed the two airports, and Mike was able to successfully destroy two airplanes that were on the ground. And as they rose back up to altitude, he thought they were presumably headed back to Ramitelli. And as it turns out, two of the pilots said, no, let's go look for other targets of opportunity. So they went and strafed a rail yard. And then when they got back up to altitude, again, my father was thinking, okay, enough guys, let's go home. We're running out of fuel. But his wingman, unauthorized, went down and strafed the rail yard again. And so he was definitely breaking military protocol by taking an unauthorized run down the rail yard. But again, if you keep in mind, these guys are 22, 23, they all think they're going to live forever. And so the wingman went off, and so my father had to follow him down. So he noticed a train of rail cars, and he started to fire at the rail cars, but unbeknownst to him, one of the rail cars that he was firing at was full of ammunition. It was a munitions car. So he blew it up, but he was so close to it at the time of the explosion, he was unable to fly around it. So he had to actually fly through the very explosion that he had created. And so as he went back up to altitude, his plane had caught on fire, the cockpit was blackened out, and the other three were saying, Smith, what happened? He said, I don't know, but I need your help. I can't see out of the cockpit. And so they said, Smith, you're leaking fuel. And he was looking at the fuel gauges, and he could see that one was completely empty and one was about to be empty. And he thought, okay, well, let me just switch to the last fuel tank that's available and see how far I can make it. And he said, Michael, as he switched to the empty fuel tank, it was like running into a wall. Well, what happened was he wasn't leaking fuel, he was leaking engine coolant, ethylene glycol. And as you can imagine, if you don't have any engine coolant, your engine's gonna catch on fire. And so that's what happened. And so he had to bail out of the flaming airplane. And when he landed, in the course of bailing out, unlike today where you just press a button, ejection button, back then you had to turn the plane upside down and fall out of the airplane. Well, turning a plane upside down that's on fire and doesn't have an engine is much harder to do. And so as his plane was spinning out of control, he got trapped, couldn't get out of the airplane. couldn't get back into the airplane. He was sort of halfway out of the airplane, and he was caught, and his oxygen mask had flown off, and he had lost consciousness. But he had the presence of mind just before losing consciousness to pull the ripcord on his parachute, and the ripcord actually pulled him out of the plane, but it separated his shoulder, snapped his hip in half, turned his foot 180 degrees around. And so as he was descending to the ground, he regained consciousness, but realized he was coming down to the ground upside down, and that his parachute was ripped. And he was thinking, so this is how pilots go. And he didn't think he was going to make it. Well, as fortune would have it, there was enough of the canopy of the parachute that it opened that it caught the top of a tree, which broke his fall. And so he landed in the tree. And then the Germans pulled him out of the tree, and he was put into a prisoner of war camp where he spent the last 8 months of the war, severely injured. He was in a full body cast. And it took 2 years of operations following the war for him to be fully healed. He returned to Iowa, got his degree in engineering, and went on to a 38-year career as an aerospace engineer with General Electric.
Oh, wow. That was quite the cliffhanger story you were telling. I was waiting for that to be his final mission, the last day of his life, and he then goes on to live 38 years. Wow.
Well, I will entice your listeners to come to the Harrison Center, because I just gave you the tip of the iceberg of that last mission.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Well, thank you for sharing that. I was trying to do the math and thinking, okay, if that was if that was the end of his life, how are you born?
Right, exactly.
Anyway, well, it has been my pleasure here to have on Buzz for Good Gordon Smith, who is an expert on the Tuskegee Airmen and will be coming to the Harrison Museum of African American Culture and Center in the Square on January the 6th, 5:30 p.m. For a presentation. The Harrison Museum is asking for donations, minimum of $25, and children are free. And if you want to get just a wonderful perspective from the son of a Tuskegee Airman, and the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen, then please make plans to attend on January the 6th. One last question. Your presentation is called The Legend of the Tuskegee Airmen. Why do you call it The Legend? Are you trying to dispel some of the fact from fiction?
Well, yeah, exactly. Again, as I told you, I was an American history major, so I'm one of those geeks that likes to deal with facts and figures and make sure that things are presented properly. And I think, Michael, maybe a lot of your listeners know a little bit about the Tuskegee Airmen, but not really clear about some of the details.
Well, I'm one of them. I'm from Alabama, and I've always heard of, of course, the Tuskegee Institute, where Booker T. Washington helped, found it and run it, and then of course the Tuskegee Airmen. But beyond that, and the fact that they fought in World War II, and then the movie Red Tails, that's basically my knowledge of the Tuskegee Airmen.
Right. So what I do when I have the privilege of speaking, Michael, is just talk about this history of the airmen and kind of dispel a little bit about some notions that people may have had about them and what they did, and just really kind of provide for the audience exactly what these extraordinary men were able to achieve, what they had to go through, the obstacles that they went through, as I shared earlier, just to become aviators, the obstacles they went through in training, what it was like as fighter pilots. And as I said, many of them had to fly well beyond the required tour of duty, the accomplishments that they were able to achieve, and the legacy that they have. There were 355 pilots, Michael, who deployed with the 332nd, actually flew in combat. There are only 3 left today. So there's just not a lot of opportunity for us to hear firsthand exactly what took place, what they did, what their accomplishments were, what their legacy has been. And so I always end my talks by saying this is part of our history. This is something that we can be very, very proud of. And so it's just as I've said before, my great pleasure and privilege to be able to talk about the Tuskegee Airmen.
Well, thank you again for your time, Gordon Smith, who will be here again in Roanoke at the Harrison Museum of African American Culture Inside Center in the Square on Friday, January the 6th at 5:30 to talk about the legend of the Tuskegee Airmen. Many thanks again.
Okay. Thank you, Michael. Happy New Year to you.
And to you.